Thank you for coming back for the final panel of our symposium. The fifth panel is panel 5, migrations and their impact on the individual. And your moderator will be my colleague, friend, and fellow host of this, Alessandra Capardoni. Alessandra is a lecturer in the Department of Humanities at Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary literature and culture, theory, psychoanalysis, and translation studies. She is particularly interested in examining how literary and cultural texts register, problematize, and critique social and economic determinants, how they orient us towards our world, how they address embodiment and materiality, and how they contribute to the production of social links with human and other than human worlds. Her work has appeared in articles and book chapters on poetics, avant-garde studies, translation and culture, feminist writings, animal studies, and psychoanalysis. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to you, Alessandra.
Thanks, James. I always feel humbled when I hear these introductions. I'm so much less than the bio seems to indicate. But it is my pleasure now to introduce our fifth panel for this event, Migrations and Impact on the Individual. And particularly interesting for our research group because it is really addressing the question of how to connect the general, the universal, with the particularity of subjectivity, individual experience. So we have three speakers for this panel: Hilda Fernandez, to be followed by Habiba Zaman, and last but not least, Anton Latana Minar. So I'm going immediately with the introduction of Hilda. I will introduce the speakers one by one, and at the very end of the panel, we will open up for discussion. Hilda Fernandez works as a Lacanian psychoanalyst in Vancouver. She has vast clinical experience in public and private settings in both Mexico and Canada. Her academic background is in clinical psychology and literature, and she is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University. Her research studies discursive spaces of trauma and healing within the mental health institution. She's a co-founder of the Lacan Salon from 2007 and currently serves as its clinical director. She's an academic associate with the Institute for the Humanities at SFU and leads a clinical seminar in Vancouver, has been leading a clinical seminar in Vancouver since the fall of 2015. She has published numerous articles on psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, which I'm not going to list. She has a web page that you're welcome to see her article there. Hilda, I want also to add, is a very dear friend of mine and a great colleague, and I'm just excited to introduce her with this paper, which is entitled Trauma and Memory Transmission, Silence and the Body. And so it is over to you, Hilda.
I have to unmute myself. I have to give myself voice. Thank you, Alessandra, for such a warm introduction. Before starting, I want to thank Alessandra, Erini, and James for organizing this event that brings into conversation important issues of our ongoing malaise. In this talk, I will bring a psychoanalytic approach to discuss the way trauma entwined two scales: the scale of the subject, otherwise known as individual, and the scale of discourse, which refers to the social. I will do so by discussing the way trauma is transmitted intergenerationally through silences that organize language and storage memories in the body. I won't be speaking specifically about migrations, but my approach is informed by clinical practice with few refugees, one of which I'm indebted for the many years that I have worked as her analyst in and out of the institution. She's a brave Kurdish woman who have taught me the layers of complexity involved in forced migration. So thank you to her. Let's start. Trauma comes from the field of medicine, and its etymology is Greek. Trauma equals wound and designates the occurrence of a wound, evident or hidden, as well as the physical, psychological, and social consequences. This signifier is ubiquitous, but distinctly approached depending on the epistemological perspective engaged. Trauma involves some aspects of perceived violence, threat, or destructivity, unassimilable by symbolic means. The causes of trauma vary considerably in terms of their geographical scale, setting, and distributions. Trauma can emanate from public and widespread phenomena such as war, famine, land dispossession, political persecution, or environmental degradation. And it can emanate from private and localized psychical events triggered by the specific experience of the individual. The signification of what constitutes traumatic is always singular. For example, the mental health patients that participated in my PhD research associated the word trauma to the experiences of psychosis, hospitalization, homelessness, developmental and sexual abuse, suicide loss, drug use, the cycles of trauma repetition, and of course, death and sexuality. People with trauma sequela present symptoms of repetition that go from invasive memories, nightmares, or panic attacks to dissociations, avoidance, social isolation, or inhibition, alongside the multiple protean somatic symptoms that accompany trauma. The body carries a heavy burden and the mind gets easily overwhelmed, creating a fecund soil to get re-traumatized if not harnessed somehow. At the collective level, when a traumatic situation occurs, it affects a community and causes social trauma that Giddens characterizes as, quote, breakdown of legitimate social expectations and the rapid decay of social institutions and social structure, unquote. The studies on trauma range from early psychoanalytic attempts to understand the unconscious dimensions of psychical trauma to psychiatric approaches concerned with the treatment of the emotional and mental sequelae, to understandings of trauma in the wider social context of geopolitics, history, and culture. There is a large body of research attempting to find ways of treating trauma, to think and treat trauma. Trauma and the impulse to heal it is present in every order of human knowledge as it refers to the unsayable of human experience. To heal trauma, to stop its insistent repetition, one needs to inscribe it or assimilate it by symbolic means. The trauma field has spread rapidly since its introduction into psychiatry in the 80s. Kinsler states that, quote, the post-traumatic stress disorder is an example of how society and politics have helped to create rather than discover mental illness, unquote. There are a number of critiques regarding the use of diagnostic tools and treatments deployed for psychological humanitarian help to non-Western populations, for example. These interventions kind of deployed to displaced refugees of war are often implemented from a Western perspective, ignoring cultural specificity. The treatment of individual trauma is complicated by the fact that it's increasingly being viewed as a biological disorder by the authority of the biomedical and pharmaceutical regimes that sustain the mental health field around the world. I say film, that's an interesting split. And the eclipse explanations of trauma by other causes, this sort of modality of the biomedical weaken social bonding and denigrate epistemological approaches other than the hegemonic in place. But what we call individual trauma is never as isolated from a societal level. As Becker says, one must embed individual biography in the larger matrix of culture, history, and political economy, unquote. This approach is fundamental to understand the social aspect of trauma, but it doesn't include the intrapsychic experience, which on the other hand is indispensable to observe how the social and the subject entwine. So let's see what psychoanalysis can tell us about how trauma establishes a link between these two scales. One first approach, constitutive and constituted traumas, consists in identifying the spatial nesting of trauma in the subject's psychic apparatus. The occurrence of contingent traumatic events such as abuse, illness, violent death, natural disaster, or dispossession are experiences that come to us by chance in the sense that its occurrence is not a necessity and by all odds should rather never have occurred. This contingent trauma comes unlodged in an already existent event or previous disruptive occurrence, the necessary, which refers to the structural traumas that manifest in every human subject within a continuum of intensity and consequence, and that is the necessary trauma that has made us human subjects: death, sexuality, and otherness. This coincides roughly with the three sources responsible for our suffering, according to Freud: our body with its anguish and pain, the external world and its destructive forces, for example, COVID-19, and our relationship to others, which Freud says is perhaps more painful to us than any other. That is to say, trauma is relational. Thus, misfortune come always to lodge within the discursive space of previous trauma and its lack of signification. Contingent traumas experienced by men, women, and children links personal misfortune to structural traumas, which links communities through linguistic mechanisms that includes the not said, the silences that reside in the body. Sex, death, and otherness is the field of the drive. These experiences left a mark from the savage on symbolized real that claims inscription by a subject to stop repetition. I won't develop here the relationship of trauma and drive, which involves the theme of jouissance and the specificity of repetition, because people, that's a larger part of my dissertation. So how do we understand entwinement, the transmission of intergenerational trauma and the body? Past horrors of Black enslavement, the Holocaust and other genocides, wars of any kind, the brutality of colonization, or past and present totalitarian regimes are all universal tragedies, which somehow touch each of us in our particular geopolitical reality. Being events of the eruption of the unsymbolizable real, they permeate current social discourses and practices at large. The entwinement between the subject and her collective context is delicate and almost invisible, yet too powerful. There is an unconscious transmission of trauma and is alive in all of us. Past and present entwinement manifests in our compulsion to repeat self-destructive acts and behaviors. Trauma memory involves repeating instead of remembering, repeating instead of inscribing. We carry a body that is colonized by affect and discursive repetitions without signification. There is a central split between knowledge and truth. What we experience of the corporeal jouissance doesn't meet signification. In other words, learn and live experiences and memories are split. We learn history through information and knowledge. We have facts, dates, narrative, and family romances, as Freud would say. Yet there is another history that lacks knowledge, whose hidden truth has been coded in silences and in what has remained unsaid. This lived memory palpitates in the body and expresses through affect and repetition. The traumatic memories are silently transmitted through the lineage and tradition, and they are present as naturalizations of significations that shape our embodied position toward class, race, gender, age, etc. Again, our positions are informed by historical unconscious reason. The elements that constitute the individual, the subject, and her immediate transgenerational history is traceable in language, usually to three generations, as I claim somewhere else. In approaching the relationship between the social and the individual, we can see the rope of the collective, but not the quality of each of its fibers. The procedure of how representation and repression works are intractable in the total aggregate of the 1 + 1. Such lack of representation of the subject can be mapped through the discursive accommodation of the non-say through silences. A powerful example of the entwinement between individual and collective memory, and where story meets history, is found in the work of our esteemed SFU colleague, Roger Free, who wrote the book, Not in My Family, German Memory and Responsibility After the Holocaust, which follows the discovery of an unspoken Nazi history in Free's German family. In his book, Free holds the nuances of historical transmission, transgenerational trauma, and his own personal journey, alternating the rigorous academic craft of the historian of culture with the compassionate and professional voice of the psychoanalyst. Free writes that when he found the photograph of his beloved grandfather wearing a Nazi pin on his lapel, it mobilized fear and curiosity to know about it, highlighting the crucial question of whether or not we want to know about the past trauma of our previous generation that live in us. Free elegantly says, if we listen carefully to what history tells us, we might hear whispers of an unspoken past, of calamitous events that are hidden by silence, unquote. Lacan, in his seminar on transference, speaks about the configuration of desire within a tragic logic of sacrifice. This approach might account for the transmission of traumatic content through a signifier appearing and disappearing within a lineage in a three-stage intergenerational process that is shaped within death and guilt. In the first generation of our grandparents, a signifier is born, a signifier that ties a certain way of enjoyment of life and death, which in the case of Free refers to the shame and moral responsibility not experienced by the grandfather, the appearance of a signifier of absence in the negative. The second generation, his parents, repress those signifiers but are passed to their children through the blanket of silence, through what is said and not said about the participation of the family in the Nazi Germany. The third generation, of which Free is a member, receives the effects of the signifier, which reappear as a return of the repressed, which once discovered or revealed needs to be inscribed. This linguistic transmission of trauma occurs within a network of relationships that create discursive traditions, which are the support of material practices. This aspect of social transmission of traumatic content can be conceptualized by discussing discursive formations, but that corresponds to the Lacanian theory of discourse. And we won't talk about this today because I'm writing my dissertation. So let's conclude with some reflections on healing collective trauma to heal individuals. Trauma is very difficult to heal because it has bodily, linguistic, and ethical short circuits. The neurophysiology of the body who suffer traumatic experience maintain a circuit of affect that sustains repetition, and it always occurs within social and relational attachments. Linguistically, our family histories are nested in the geopolitical, economic, and cultural milieu in which a tradition is forged. And although not all traumas have a large or visible political impact, all trauma in a way has contributed to support the onset. It is an ethical responsibility to explore trauma because each individual that gets to articulate something of that traumatic residue contributes to acknowledging the larger connection to the social. But reviewing the predetermined fate that our singular tradition and lineage have prescribed to us is not an easy task. It is resisted because we go against our familial loyalties, and we are forced to challenge our identity. Trauma healing requires to be heard and accompanied, demands acknowledgement, a compassionate reception, and the restoration of justice. This process requires the confluence of diverse orders of knowledge, for which none has the last word on the matter. There are many attempts. I'm gonna skip like some of the examples, maybe in the discussion, some examples of ways of trying to heal the individual and the collective together. And just wanna grab saying that there's an urgent need to heal trauma as per the long-lasting suffering effects when not witnessed, when not recognized, and because of the horizon we face with increasing climate change situation, refugees, consolidation of cyborgic subjectivities, and of course the effects of the pandemic. All of this untreated trauma by inequity, colonization, racism, sexual brutality, patriarchy, or social isolation keeps repeating itself when not named or processed. This should not be a task whose responsibility falls exclusively on mental health grounds, neither to be handled on the sole hands of medicine or testimonial artistic practices. Trauma requires a communal effort to attend trauma sequela and requires to respect diverse orders of knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilda, for a very rich presentation that is obviously begging a lot of questions and analysis. I'm going to move quickly to our second speaker, which is, not to scroll through my programs, my former colleague from the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies, Habiba Zaman. Habiba Zaman is a professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies. She's also an associate member of SFU Labor Studies program and an honorary research associate of the Center for India and South Asia Research, the Institute of Asian Research, the University of British Columbia. Zaman is the author of several books and reports, including Breaking the Iron Wall, Decommodification, and Immigrant Women's Labor in Canada, which appeared in 2006. Asian Immigrants in Two Canadas, Racialization, Marginalization, and Deregulated Work from 2012. And Workplace Rights for Immigrants in BC, the Case of Filipino Workers from 2007. Professor Zaman has edited a journal volume titled Migration of Bengalis to Canada, History, Settlement, Identity and Activism in the Alternate Routes from 2019. In 2017, Professor Zaman organized a national conference entitled Canada 150 Migration of Bengalis, the first ever documentation of migration of Bengalis to Canada. She was a board member of the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, SANSAD, and the South Asian Film Education Society, SAFES, for a decade. The paper of Habiba Zaman is entitled Memories from War, Living in a Borderless Zones. And I'm going now to pass the microphone and the platform to her. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Alessandra. And thank you, organizers, James, Irene, and Alessandra, for inviting me to present to this timely symposium. This paper is part of my ongoing memoir book project. The title of my paper is Memories from War, Living in Borderless Zones. A proverb says, even if there is famine, don't leave a city. The logic of the proverb is that a city offers opportunities. Thus, despite famine in the city, one can strategize ways to survive. Moving to Dhaka, a city for undergrad education at the University of Dhaka from Borishal, a suburban town, marked a critical juncture in my life. Not only did I witness the student protests and mass political social movements of 1969 and 1971, but I also experienced the liberation movement, the military's clampdown on civilians in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, the armed conflicts, and the exodus of people, Hindus, Muslims, Christians to India, fleeing genocide by the Pakistan army. In 1971 December, I witnessed the independence of Bangladesh. In 1971, the independence movement, as well as the Pakistan military's brutalities, created borderless zones in the then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. I left the city, that is Dhaka, for a small border town where my mother was working as a customs officer. However, the political uncertainties, as well as the armed conflicts, drastically shattered the quiet border town where I took refuge. In the presentation today, my objective is to share some of the unforgettable memories. What my previous speaker Hilda mentioned, that traumatic memories, both pains and pleasures that crisscross language, culture, religion, caste, ethnicity, territory, age, genders, and class. I never shared these traumatic memories in a consistent way with anyone. I will narrate several unforgettable episodes. I say episodes, especially for my presentation, to explain the different kind of incidents or events in my life in borderless zones. Borderless zones refer to current Bangladesh and India land water borders that were unrestricted for displaced people from March to December in 1971. Feel free to ask me any questions once the presentation is over. Further, I request you to send me your feedback to my SFU email, hjaman@sfu.ca. Unforgettable memories in borderless zones. Sorry. To conceal my age and youthfulness from all sorts of assaults, including sexual, I stopped wearing the shalwar kameez, an outfit for young women, and voluntarily dressed in sari, a loose garment, petticoat and blouse, all white, and covered my head with the edge of the sari. Amma, my mother, always wore white sari, and thus the garments were readily available without visiting any shopping mall. Anyone could easily have mistaken me for a widow or an old woman or a working class woman on the days I had bare feet. The fact that my white attire, head covering, and dark skin suggested I might be an aged woman in a distressed situation probably spared me attention in borderless zones. I feel called to share a few memories that I hold from this time when borders had been transgressed. Episode 1. In April 1971, I came upon a young woman with 3 young children who was standing between 2 rows of buildings in the customs colony in Benapur, a land border of Joshua. Upon inquiry, I was told that her father-in-law was a shopkeeper of a tea stall in the market and her husband and left the family because of their life-threatening situation. The family was made up of Urdu-speaking Muslim migrants from India, commonly called Biharis. And the common notion was that Urdu-speaking migrants to then East Pakistan were allies of the Pakistan military. Thus, the 1971 independence movement exploded tensions between Bengalis and Biharis, Muslims speaking different languages, causing riots, violence, and indiscriminate killings of both groups in several places in what was then East Pakistan. This family had become a target of this ethnic violence. The woman was looking for a safe shelter in the colony. Later, I learned that her children had been killed and her life had been spared only to fulfill men's lust. Episode 2. Another day in the customs colony in Benapur, Joshua, I witnessed an armed man in a border patrol khaki uniform pulling the hand of a young woman who was wearing shalwar kameez, an attire that was a symbol of youthfulness, in broad daylight, and a middle-aged woman intervening to save her from sexual assault. During this period, the customs colony was almost an abandoned place, except few families, including us, who had no male figures in the household. In a patrilineal society in then East Pakistan, males are considered as were considered as the custodians of families. Episode 3. When the Pakistan army proceeded to the customs colony in Benapur by throwing shells and mortars, we, my mother, sister, a young woman with 2 infant daughters, left the colony, rushed to the main road for a transport, and the truck driver picked us up and dropped us off in a temporary shelter in India. There was no checking at the Benapur-Petrapur land border. In Bongaon, where the temporary shelter was located, we had no toilet, either in the temporary shelter for displaced people or nearby. So we had to use an open field to relieve ourselves. Thanks to middle-class socialization, I had never learned how to pull up my sari and use an open field as a toilet. Not knowing what else to do, I managed to hold it until the sun went down before going to the field. Episode 4. On our way to Baharampur via Ranaghat from Bongaon in India by train in a third-class compartment, a female vegetable seller became our guide and kept us safe throughout the journey, as we were scared of robbers because we carried jewelry and money, the only resource for our survival in crisis. For various reasons, including armed robbery, it was unsafe for the displaced people to move around at night due to fear of encountering the robbers. Episode 5. In Baharampur, a district town of West Bengal of India, Amma, my mother, went to a neighbor's place to take a shower and wash our clothes because the place where we were staying suffered from a scarcity of water. Fortunately, a Muslim neighbor volunteered her place that had plenty of water, a spacious courtyard, and a bathroom. Once Amma learned that the man living there had 2 co-wives. However, she never allowed me to visit the place. According to Amma, quote unquote, having co-wives indicates a man's evil eyes. This is my translation. Being a religious Muslim woman, Amma, my mother, vehemently opposed polygamous marriage. Episode 6. In Nimtita, a place full of neem trees, a poverty-stricken village of West Bengal of India, we all had to bathe in a public pond, accessible to anyone irrespective of gender, religion, and age. The challenge was how to change out of a wet outfit in an open field. On the first day of our open bath, we discovered a nearby building that was under construction. I was about to change my clothes there when suddenly a child showed up and asked me to go to the next house where some woman wished to meet me. The moment I showed up there wearing wet clothes, 3 young Hindu women wearing sari invited me to change clothes in their bathroom. They accompanied me inside their spacious brick-built house, a structure that demonstrated their wealth. To my utter surprise, they shared chutney, pickle made of green mango, and rasgulla, a favorite dessert for Bengali, with me once I changed my wet outfit. They even invited me to use their washroom whenever I bathed, and the memory of their angelic generosity and support has remained with me to this day. Upon their asking, I told them a little about myself. The women were astonished that I was a university student when they had not even passed their school exams. Later, I learned that 2 of the young women were twins whose mother had committed suicide when they were infants, while the other young woman's mother was a widow. I now wish I could say thanks and goodbye to these 3 young, kind women the day I left the place, Nimtita, a remote village. Episode 7. In Bhagavan Gola, Murshidabad of India, Amma visited a business person she knew through her job as a customs officer in Premtoli, Rajshahi, in northern Bangladesh. This wealthy man immediately promised to provide us with shelter by allowing us to stay in a room in his spacious brick-built house. After finding out that the man had 4 young adult sons, however, Amma left the house the following day. Throughout this uncharted journey, Amma protected me like a tigress. She tried her best to provide me comfort, both emotional and physical, during this traumatic journey. Episode 8. In a remote village in Murshidabad, we incidentally met a potter who was a lower caste Hindu, displaced and hailed from Premtoli, where Amma previously worked. He advised Amma not to purchase any mosquito netting and instead save money for more pressing needs. Thanks to our previous middle-class lifestyle, we had utterly failed to prioritize the basic necessities even when we were undocumented individuals. I said, quote unquote, undocumented, because we never lived in a refugee camp in India, always made private arrangements for accommodation as well as living, and thus unaccounted in conventional sense. Episode 9. I will never forget the day when we crossed the border ledge and returned to Premtoli in Rajshahi, where Amma worked as a customs officer. We took a long walk in the very early morning, and all of us were barefoot. As we were crossing the rice fields one after another, we spent one night in a hut on a chor, a small uninhabited island. During the night, the owner of the house, a farm worker, slept on the veranda or balcony while we slept in his one-bedroom thatched house without any lock. With no alternative, we trusted him for our survival. In reality, he acted as the custodian or guard for our safety in that uninhabited island. While on the shore, I bathed in the Padma River, holding tightly onto Amma, lest the current snatch me away. Episode 10 and the final episode. It was a moonless, dark night when we crossed the Padma River to return from India to then East Pakistan. To me, it looked like an endless boat journey, and I heard only my heartbeat and the sound of water as two people were rowing the boat. The boat was an ordinary fishing boat without any roof. The two fishermen who assisted us in crossing the Padma River by manually rowing us across were not only knowledgeable about the mighty river, but were exceptionally caring and cautious about our safety. The moment the boat landed at Premtoli, a water border of Rajshahi, Amma's former workplace, a group of fictive relatives were waiting there to receive us and protected us from the Pakistan military's capture and raids. They immediately took us to their house for the shelter overnight and then made all arrangements so that we could arrive in Dhaka. Briefly, the journey from Rajshahi, a burned city by the Pakistan army, to Dhaka was the most frightening one. And I regretted about our decision to return to Dhaka, almost a deserted city where only Pakistan army were roaming around. The hustle bustle of Dhaka city and the liberatory slogan, quote unquote, Joy Bangla, seemed distant past. In conclusion, I like to state, irrespective of religion, caste, class, age, gender, and language, many people I met during our uncharted, breathless, and traumatic borderless journey guided and assisted us. And no words can adequately express their generosity and kindness. The six of us, my mother, myself, and my younger sister, and a woman with two girl children, were almost on the verge of extinction. And these acquaintances, though they were neither blood nor marital relatives, saved us from disappearing from this world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Habiba, for a very moving and such personal story. There are so many questions that were already coming up to my mind, but we'll leave that to the question and answer period. And I'm very glad that these two last papers, Habiba and Anton, that I'm going to introduce in a moment, are really taking back the theoretical, the political, the social, the psychological, back to the individual experience, because I think that in the end, this is what is really determining this, the need for this sort of inquiry. If you have questions, you can wave your hand and immediately voice your question. Otherwise, use the Q&A format or the chat format. So I have first Clint. You want to go ahead, and then Hilda.
Okay. Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you all three for some amazing different stories of migration and trauma. Trauma is little and big, perhaps, or even forgotten. My question is for Hilda, and it has to do, I mean, I think it's very important on the one hand that you talked about the relation between the subject and discourse, or between the personal and the social. And then also, especially the relationship between necessary or structural trauma, which for psychoanalysis has to do with like the introduction of language, the coming into subjectivity, the birth of the unconscious, we might say, and contingent or external trauma. So the conditions of whether it's this is war or genocide or sexual assault, and I don't want to make a list because it's disrespectful to make a list. But my question has to do with your example, which I wasn't quite sure on where the trauma for Roger Free was the trauma finding out his grandfather was a Nazi. That's not really, I mean, there's things that we're upset about. We're all embarrassed by our Trump voting relatives and so on. But how, if you're talking about trauma at different kinds of levels, I wasn't following where the trauma was in that narrative and the three generations you were talking about. So maybe you could work that through a bit more for me or for us. For
sure. The example came when I participated in his book launch. And for me, it's a way that he was able to talk about what was hidden in his previous generation. That constitutes trauma in the sense that is silence about something of larger kind of social, ethical, moral, political relevance. And my point of bringing him into, obviously I kind of presented his book, and he heard what I mentioned today, so he is aware of my perspective. I wanted to bring him into discussion because I really think that he exemplifies the mechanisms of how we are forced to deal with our kind of shameful past, if you want to call, in every generation. So there are things that our parents didn't tell us that happened in previous generation. I'm talking about structural trauma or contingent trauma. So those things start to present in the symptom of the person, in the way they react. I don't know what is the trauma of Free because I'm not his analyst, but I think that by his writing that book, he is acknowledging something that was forbidden to speak on the one hand, and obviously insisting. He talks about well, his whole journey in the book. So I think yeah, that's why I use it. For me, it's quite clear because it presents that way in the clinical.
Hilda, do you want to go next? And then I have Sanem, Sergio, and perhaps James. I'm not sure if I saw a hand or not, but Hilda first.
I don't have any question.
Oh,
I mean, I just say hello to everyone. Oh. But no, I just want to thank Habiba and Antoine because I really, really enjoy your presentations. Yeah, but no, I don't have at the moment a question.
Sanem then?
Thank you, and thank you for all the three presentations, incredibly rich and lots to think about. I have a question for Hilda. Actually, two questions. Hilda, do I understand you correctly that trauma is kind of like located between repetition and reinscription, between habit and, or between bodily affect or habit itself, and then memory. And in this, and if I'm correct, if in this equation, whether or not the repetition itself is something that needs to be eliminated, or that needs to be molded, or that needs to be reinscribed in the symbolic as language. So that is the one question. I wasn't sure, really sure what you were making the argument. I'm kind of blurred about it. And secondly, if that is the case, I mean, there is difference in repetition, right? And that constitutes the habit. And when we're thinking about constituting a habit, we're also thinking about the constituting, like a new subjectivity that is born there. So what, and is that subjectivity altogether the subjectivity that we do not want? Is there something salvageable there? If this is the case, that I'm understanding you correctly, that repetition itself is the symptom, and if the repetition itself is something that needs to be dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you for the rich question. Compulsive repetition, it's an issue that has to do with the death drive. According to Freud, to Lacan, it's something that repeats constantly with the purpose of mere repetition. In that repetition, often what happens, particularly, for example, about trauma kind of sequela, is nightmares, that sort of number of kind of symptoms. But we have all compulsive repetitions, right? Like we want to stop doing certain habits, as you call it, or behaviors that are somehow destructing our ability to have agency, compassion, etc. So the arresting the compulsive repetition is one of the tasks of an analytic process. And I work a little bit about that theme in the article, So You Want a Master in the Spectre of Fascisms, that Samir Gandesha edited, to try to talk about the necessary, the contingent, the possible, and the impossible. So how in that repetition that you are talking, yeah, there's always possibility. There's always possibility that that same force can be harnessed and signify kind of deciding on the event in a different way. Let's say some people that suffer horrible situations, they can at some point, by linguistic means, by the relationship with the person who they are working on, the relationship with their craft in creationist healing processes, they are trying to grasp this possibility of going in a different direction, signifying differently. But it occurs in the compulsive repetition, right? Just to kind of get a different path outside of victimhood or whatever.
As for the question to Hilda, in your clinical experience in British Columbia, would you say that specific traumas might be a defining feature for some ethnicities of refugees? For example, the Nakba for Palestinians, which is a sort of traumatic wave still expanding itself on more generations after 7 decades.
Yeah, in my clinical experience, the most important experience with regards to groups that have been traumatized is the indigenous population. Through my research, mainly the engagement with the Aboriginal wellness team, for example, kind of, it was very, very, very rich. I mean, I learned there the differences between kind of more localized traumas of a structural nature, contingent as well. For example, I don't know, family abuse, developmental abuse. I understood there the difference between that level of trauma and the one that is injected by, or kind of imposed by the state. It creates completely different avenues. I don't know of other ethnicities, but that by itself for me was like eye-opener in terms of whereas in, let's say, developmental trauma, there's a sense that somehow, somewhere outside of my family, someone holds the law that might protect me at some point, no? Even in fantasy. When it's genocide, the state, there's no law. It's the homo sacer, no? The in the morning was discussed. So yeah, that was a great humbling learning with that population particularly.
Thank you, Hilda.
And I have a question also from Robert. So Robert, did you want to say it directly, or do you want me to read it? As you prefer. If I don't hear from you, sorry, there is no way I'm able to stop here. So the question for Robert was, Hilda, as you were speaking, you said you made a slip regarding the signifier field. Do you want to unpack that further? Also, why is it important, and the second part of the question relates to Anton's, why is it important to delink Italianness from whiteness?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that one. Yeah, I wanted to say the mental health field, and I said the mental health film. So the first kind of associations that I have is the certain fictional aspect in the attempts to heal the complexities of trauma with psychoeducational manualized therapies that are used hegemonically all over the world in the mental health film, right? It's like a movie that we tell ourselves that we are serving people to get better. And what I see is that if trauma is relational and you are just kind of providing manualized therapy, then it's a film, it's a fiction. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Anton, you want to respond to the second one?
Sure. I think it's a really important question. I'm going to answer it a little bit with my Celticist hat on, because I don't think it's important to de-link Italianness and whiteness. I think it's important to come to a more complex understanding of whiteness, because I think whiteness is a really inherently problematic identity.
Yeah.
And it's also an identity that's, it really does have an ethnic core to it. It's English identity, Anglophone at least. And what's happened as immigrants have come in and been assimilated to it is we retain the labels of an earlier ethnicity, but the whiteness, it just kind of paints everyone with the same brush, and it allows you to retain an identity, but not to understand that your identity has changed and joined this kind of hegemonic one. And so one thing I see is, for instance, in Celtic studies, where one of the groups we study is the Irish, there's a ton of Americans and Canadians of Irish descent, such as these famous stupid Proud Boys, who have zero understanding of what it means to be Irish culturally. They don't know the language, they don't know the literature, they don't know the history, they don't know anything, which creates this blank slate for them to implant their various purity narratives on, as to it's like now, but better because it was just us pure white folks somewhere in the past. And that is like, there's about 15,000 ways that that's wrong-headed. But by not speaking about it, and by not speaking about these heritage ethnic groups in the context of whiteness, we effectively facilitate that. So we allow people to escape whiteness into these imagined identities, which just happen to have an overlap with their heritage identities. And so, like, for me, I think it's really important to challenge people's ideas of whiteness, of what they think it is and what they think it does and what they think it's for, right? I'm never going to be able to escape white privilege, because people who look like me get that the same way we get male privilege. But at the same time, I want to challenge people's notion that when they see me, they think they know something about my values and my background, and they don't, right? They've made an incorrect assumption. And if we were to allow a little bit more diversity into a little bit more understanding of ethnicity in the predominant discourse of race, then I think we might be less prone to allowing people to kind of hive off and create these really toxic imagined identities while actually performing this broader hegemonic racialized identity. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of my academic laced rant about it.
Yes, it was very good, I think. I have Irene, and then I have a question for Habiba too, following Irene. Irene, you want to go first?
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentations. I'll try to formulate my question as clear as possible. You mentioned trauma as relational. I'm thinking always of identities as relational. So in the power of sharing, first of all, what serves as a trigger for sharing the memories? And Anton and Habiba, perhaps you can share what brought you to, what enabled you, or what was the moment, if you can pinpoint it, where you were ready to share episodes or start looking further back into what had transpired with your identities. And there is, Hilda, you mentioned that you could elaborate on the examples where we can heal, the individual can heal, but as well with the collective. So perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that. I remember reading, and perhaps not interpreting it accurately, Bracha Ettinger talking about co-pieces, where identities start being antagonistic and you coexist, and all of a sudden you shape each other based on the experiences and the narrations of identities that are being presented. So perhaps we're witnessing it right now.
Habiba?
Yes. I think if I can understand the question very clearly, that what factors did motivate me to share these memories. I think I am not writing a book on any kind of traumatic memories. That this presentation is just part of my book project that I mentioned, which is called Memoir. And in that book project, I have used a very much life cycle kind of narrative from my childhood, birth, and everything, you know, youthfulness, everything. And in chapter 4, I narrated my university life, which is very unconventional, because I witnessed the war, I witnessed everything, homelessness, and I became almost destitute during that time. So in 2016, when I had my sabbatical, I started to document, because I always consider that these stories, these narratives must be told and shared. And the episodes I also narrated because I never got opportunity to share with anyone, because that academics or scholarly books will not recognize that. This is your personal narrative. You need to have theoretical approach and everything. So when I went through that academic phase, I had no time to document it. And so I am glad that this conference or this symposium gave me that opportunity to share with it. And at the same time, that is also very, I think that is very unfortunate that most women, they do not document their experiences in a book. And even during that liberation war that I narrated, only one woman who was a feminist who documented the entire, actually their daily lives or daily planner, that in a diary, and then it was published. And I must say that Jahanara Imam, who was feminist, everyone knows, I think that she inspired me also to share my own experiences. And this is, and also that I teach also that immigrants, women, transnational migration, and I am also a member, is No One Is Illegal, that organization, that which is very, sometimes people say, which is very different, you know. And I also think that I have also empathies for this undocumented, that refugees, and I am also very much, you know, conscious of the Holocaust that happened, you know, and also the other kind of traumatic experiences, especially that currently is happening in the Mediterranean and also that Middle Eastern countries. That also inspired me to share that experiences in my book or in book project. And thank you for giving me the platform to share. And I have got also some kind of ideas from this, especially the trauma. And I like also Hilda's that approach, that is also a structural issue, it's not an isolated individual, that trauma, you know. And I want to share also with you that fortunately, you know, that I never went through any kind of therapy or anything. It was my mother, who provided me not only comfort, but all emotional support during my entire phase. And I have come from a very extended family, that what Anthony has also mentioned, that those Keynes relatives, they sheltered me, they loved me, and I think through their love, through their affection, and through different ways, especially my mother, who actually helped me to heal this kind of experiences. And I also migrated to Canada 40 years ago. So you understand that there is every reason to forget this kind of experience. And I don't have any documentation that I can say that I have these letters, because of this kind of migration, this kind of that destitution, that I actually lost everything. And especially I lost everything during that war, the independence war. We became destitute just overnight. So I thought that I should share this with other people. Yeah, thank you.
And we're very grateful for exposing so much of yourself and this experience with all of us. And I think that you touched this in your response, how it is really an issue for regarding the documentation of women's voices. For different reasons, in different contexts, and through different problematics, they're so much more difficult to record in a way or another, precisely because of that lack of documentation. My question for you, I see there is another question coming up, but first I want to use the privilege of the moderator. My question for you was, it sort of builds on Irene's question. But first of all, what does it mean for yourself to revisit this history at this particular moment of your life? And I know that your scholarly work from a sociological perspective has to do with immigration and women, but to what extent has this experience shaped your research in academia? And whether or not, do you experience a kind of split from, this kind of objectivist language that you need to employ every time you write academically, and the emotionality that I'm sure must be coming from personal history?
Thank you. I think this is really a great question, Alessandra, I must say. And as I said, I migrated to Canada 40 years ago, but I was an international student, So to me, that having that permanent residency, citizenship, it was a long way to get it. And when I migrated here, I was also a political scientist. I did my master's and honors in political science in Bangladesh. And I was also a lecturer there, an academic. So I came here as a student just to do my master's, first in political science, and then that I did my PhD in anthropology and women's studies. The reason I am just narrating this, that when I got a job that at SFU, Simon Fraser University, that it also reflects that that a woman's academic life is also completely different from men's. If you are a migrant, if you are a racialized woman, that your experience is also completely different, and you can say it's also individualized, although you can make some commonalities. So when I was hired by SFU, I was actually, my focus, my research, my publication, everything was very much related to South Asia, South Asian politics, South Asian everything. And I was hired in 1995, and in 1996, I got some fund, and I went to Bangladesh to do some research with garment workers and also some political issues. I stayed there in 3 months, and I collected tons of information. But when I returned, I was frightened because I did not write anything or publish anything, because that was a tenure track position. I must publish something, And I had very 2 young infant children, and my spouse, who that luckily had a PhD, and he supported me throughout my entire academic life, you know. And we got married in Bangladesh. So we have some kind of very much, you know, that lot of commonalities and lot of differences too. So he took care of those 2 young children, but still I felt that I did not write anything, I could not publish anything. And if I go to Bangladesh to do my research, that almost every year, you know, that means that my publication that will be almost zero, because it takes time consuming, and research semester is the best semester to sit down. And doing field work in Bangladesh, it's not an easy. There is also gender dimension. If a man does field work, the family members, everyone knows that he has come from some academic work. But if a woman goes, you know, then everyone consider that there should be some kind of busy, people will come, different expectations. But I am not going to go into that. What I would like to say, then I felt that no, I cannot go back to Bangladesh to pursue my South Asian politics and everything, you know, and women's issues, gender issues, because there are tons of issues I could do that. So I decided slowly to change my interest from South Asia to Canada, especially immigrants, migrants, transnational migration, because by that time I had that experience. I read tons of literature and everything. So, and also I had also another interest, which is development, you know, which is also huge international field, you know. But then I started to focus my own research and funds and everything, grant application, all on immigrants. And also I started to get affiliated with many that immigrant organizations. So that's the way. So I shifted actually that research trajectory from South Asia to Canada, Canadian women, immigrants women, just, you know, that to survive in academia. If you would give me that kind of chance that you do that, possibly I would stick with South Asia, its politics and its women's issues and everything. And I am not a sociologist, actually I am an interdisciplinary academic, you can say, because I was trained in political science and I did my master's in anthropology and also women's studies, but at the same time I used enormous amount of sociological literature. And once I came to that SFU, I also compiled especially 2 courses. One is immigrants, women and transnational migration, and another is gender and international development. You know, that I could also do a lot of international projects, development work, you know, and I could also earn a different kind of money in addition to my academic job. But I also decided not to do that. It's difficult to make actually balance between your family life, and especially when you want to raise your children, when you have also that spouse who also traveled internationally, and when you are also a woman. I almost was, at some point I was almost alone. So I think I have shifted my that academic research interest, you know, just strategically. It was my interest. I wanted that. It was not in my heart, but to survive in academia. I did that, but fortunately that I did that because my course is a very much popular course. I compiled also distance education course, which is always full, and I also teach also in class. That's also very huge popular course that I say. I think that, so I feel very good. And I also feel good in one sense that I shifted my research trajectory because I was able to connect with many migrant population, including Anthony, that Italian. You know, I am very much fond of that Italian immigrants. You know, and I read that literature and the Holocaust literature, you know, and yesterday there was also another kind of presentation on child survivors. You know, I listened to that Lawrence one. That one is also that fabulous, I must say, wonderful. So I think that so this shifting of academic, that interest from one to another, that more international, transnational, I think is also beneficial to me and also to my understanding of the global situation. And thank you so much. I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you, Alessandra.
Yeah, sorry. It really speaks to the limitation of academia, which voices are able really to become heard or not. And something that we are hoping to meet precisely through the creation of this research cluster on memory and trauma. We had one last question. I know we have already run out a little bit of time, but I'm going to honor at least the question if Hilda wants to reply super quickly. It is from Esteban. I believe Hilda mentioned that one important aspect of the recovery from trauma or treatment is to inscribe its truth qua self-narrative in a given symbolic platform. I very much agree. However, it makes me think about the services that the state is committed to provide via the care sector. My question would be then to Hilda, how does she think that instrumentally or operationally this symbolic inscription or treatment may be systematically provided to marginalize the community? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I would like to say a lot of things, but yeah, in the light of time, I could say that the provision of services to help moving on from traumatic experiences require kind of the combination and the dialogue between different orders of knowledge. For example, particularly my suggestions for Vancouver Coastal Health, who were very generous in funding my research, which is an institutional critique to them, which speaks about the progressive kind of mentality, is that it should be like the treatment plans should be democratically designed with a voice of the persons who are receiving the treatment, and should include artists in residence, collective aspects that are being kind of used in other places. Just answering briefly what Irini was asking, for example, there's a Brazilian ethnopsychiatrist, his name is Adalberto de Paulo, that has developed a community integrative therapy that brings solidarity to the favelas by kind of developing networks of solidarity by processing events of traumatic nature. There are Anish Inave scholar Melanie Goodchild that is approaching trauma from systemic kind of point of views. So there are many examples that we can use to integrate some knowledges from different aspects, never kind of denigrating, for example, the cultural, the spiritual, the other aspects that are absolutely important for people to move on and heal.
Thanks, Hilda, for the brevity also to a very complex question. At this point, we're already beyond the time, but I have one last announcement. Samini Ganesha asked me to mention that next Saturday, October 10th, from 7 to 8:30, there will be a presentation on Latin America by Lynn Steven on decolonizing development, insights from indigenous and other women, with a response by Gerardo Otero, and the moderator will be Ian Angus. I had prepared a kind of a longer wrap up, if not a summary, but kind of a final conclusion for the event, but we're already quarter of an hour past the time that we had allotted to this, so I will not go too much in depth into this. First of all, I want to thank again my colleagues, Irene Costovili and James Harcastle, for the work, the collegiality, and it has been a lot of work, but a lot of fun, actually, we're putting this together. Thanking the Department of Humanities and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies for the tremendous support that we have received for our organization, the co-sponsorship of the Institute of the Humanities. It was a great pleasure to bring together such a variety of voices which opened up with the discussion of the role of the state in producing exclusion from our keynote speaker, Paul Crow, and moving into different historical panels from the modern, but also antiquity and the medieval, to consider the circulation of people and the different ways in which memory and trauma are articulated at different contingencies. One of the reasons in thinking about the trans-historical was precisely challenging the idea that trauma is just a thing of the present or the recent past, but rather seeing how different historical constituencies have played into that role, in conjunction, obviously, with the cultural. We had excellent presentations in terms of different cultural forms, artistic forms, as well as the political. And I think that the conclusion of the last panels in terms of the personal was, and the individual within the collective, was really a good way to bring experience into theory itself. So I'm not going to drag on further on. We have been recording, as you know, this event. We hope at some point to create an archive of these activities that we are creating in conjunction with the research group, the research cluster that with Irene and James are forming, with the idea really of producing an interdisciplinary connection, a nexus, a matrix, if you want, a nest, where different discourses, different positions, different people and groups can speak together, learning from each other, sharing, and building up a different sense of collectivity, of research, but also of lived life experience, of course. So I'm going to thank everybody for your participation and for the tremendous energy and the work that went into this. At this point, I see 4 more messages. Well, they are the thank you, okay? So I don't have to summarize it too much. Thanks a lot. We are going to wrap up here. Enjoy a great, possibly not too rainy, longer weekend and Thanksgiving. Thanks again, and we hope we will give more details, but in the month of November to have a further panel on memory and trauma on the theme of the pandemic. So something is still close to our own experience in the presence. Thanks a lot, and we're going to conclude here. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.